So this is a book about a famous director and a very, very famous film. But it's about this director, it's about Kurosawa, before he became famous. And it's about the kind of world that made him, the world that made him want to make art in the first place, to become involved in the society and the culture that he was growing up in. And that I came to feel more and more lies deeply inside the symbolism and the storytelling of this great and very famous film, Rashomon. So the title, when I titled the book Kurosawa's Rashomon, as we know, Rashomon is famous because it cuts into what looks like the same story from several different angles. We have several different witnesses to a crime. And I came to feel more and more that among the witnesses, I needed to hear and to see Kurosawa implicated and involved. So I call Kurosawa as a witness to Rashomon. He's, yet another witness to what's happening here. And the film, and I use Rashomon, I use then the way that it's told, and I also use Kurosawa's memoir. Both of these structures, both of these stories, these narratives, are backward turning. They're both about events that took place in the past. And whereas the one is a fiction film and the other is ostensibly a story, something like an autobiography is actually the title of the memoir, seems to be about facts, the facts that happened to Kurosawa once upon a time. I came to feel that the memoir itself was constructed and made and could be looked at through the prism of the storytelling habits of Rashomon itself. So it's about a film and it's about a juncture in history, right? 1950, the immediate post-war, when, and again it would be part of the argument, that Kurosawa's real gifts, his real narrative energy, is very closely focused, very gathered and urgent in the immediate post-war period. And I wanted to better understand what gave these films, they're all in black and white in my judgment, such dramatic power. And to do that, I found it important, as Rashomon, evidently, to tell the story of Rashomon, it was important to look back at the past, at the crime that happened once upon a time in the forest, that I had to go back into the past and better understand where Kurosawa came from and the circumstances within which he was raised. The subtitle has a few divisions, and the first is A Vanished City. And the film, as everyone knows, it's a history film. It was set, the setting seems to be Kyoto in the late 1100s, a time of civil war and strife, earthquakes, famine, widely reported, fictional and non-fictional sources. And the city of Kyoto largely disappears. But Kurosawa is looking at this. I mean, it's an allegorical film, it's not a film that appeals immediately to our sense of realism, not just because it's set back in time, but the manner of the storytelling. The characters don't have names, except one. Only the robber has a name. Unnamed characters, very spare settings. So there's a kind of a symbolical, allegorical dimension. And it allows for us to look at this setting, which looks like a kind of a dead zone, right? Kyoto after earthquake, famine, war. And it came to look more and more to me like the city of Kurosawa's birth, and particularly the city after the earthquake. And it's at that point that the symbolism of the movie, for me, started to intersect and to be caught up in what we know to have transpired then in the city of his birth. Kurosawa was born in 1910. He was 13 years old when the earthquake hit and destroyed upwards of 2/3 of the built structure of Tokyo. Over 100,000 lives are lost. It's a catastrophe of magnitude. Moreover, one within which he nearly himself was lost. was in a particularly precarious part of town and left it just before the earthquake hit at noon. And this is an event which he documents with brilliance as a writer and with real dramatic energy in his memoir. And so I begin to look at scenes like that as if they had a slice and a claim on our attention in our time. So the vanished city for me is not Kyoto so much as it is Tokyo. And it's Tokyo after its first vanishing in the Great Earthquake of 23, and it's Tokyo again after its second vanishing in the fire bombings of 1945. So you could say it's a film which compresses within its symbolism trauma and its repetition, and the survivors of that trauma, the people that are left to talk about how incomprehensible the world has become, right? How, it's the first words the woodcutter says. He's our storyteller. He's sitting there under the gate. But he says, this is a world beyond my comprehension. It's a world I understand nothing about anymore. And so it's a survivor's sense, kind of story, and trying to make sense of a world that has been shattered, and to the point of utter destruction, calamity, absurdity, and it kind of stuns the mind until you have to work at getting something of that back. The Lost Brother has a more particular reference, a specific reference to the first Kurosawa in the film business, who was his older brother, Heigo. Heigo was born in 1906. He was 4 years Akira's senior. He was the star of the family. He was the bright light, not Akira. He was the one that scored top of his class in municipal examinations given to all sixth graders in Tokyo. And he was the one who puzzlingly failed a test that everybody believed he would pass. And having failed it, he proceeded basically to walk away from that world that seemed to be his for the taking. And he drifted away from his family, out onto the streets, into movie theaters. He starts to write occasional notes for film programs. And then he finds a mentor who gives him kind of instruction into how to become what was known of as a benshi, that is to say, a voice performer, who stood to the side of a Japanese silent film or a foreign film shown in Japan and let the audience know about the plot, the story, all kinds of other incidents that were happening that they might not be familiar with. And beyond that, became the characters, whoever it happened to be. And the benshi was a big deal in Japanese silent film and had a star power almost equivalent to the movie stars that were up there on the screen. That's what Heigo became. That's what he did in the 1920s. And from all reports, it was this older brother who took Akira along to see many of the films that, as I would say, form the inner core of his visual and his oral memory of seeing these early movie experiences that he would have had, which were exclusively of silent film, voice without mechanical, that is, film without mechanical sound, but which were hardly silent. But the sound came from persons, right? Live performers. And one of those performers was his brother. And I became more and more interested in the way in which, for all of his skill and his mastery of visuals, right, of using the way he uses the camera, Kurosawa was, I think, especially attuned to what he called dubbing and the sound that he would put to these images. And whether it was, the care with which he put together the music for his films, the strangeness of some of that, it's the contrapuntal use of music and sound, the silences that open up in many of his films, the very intricate use of voiceover in his films. I came more and more that this brother, whose life would be cut short by his own desperation and by his own hand. He committed suicide in 1933, another haunting passage in Kurosawa's memoir. That this brother and his voice and what that voice meant to the young Kurosawa is something that never left him. So The Vanished City, The Lost Brother, and then the voice inside the iconic films, they all kind of hang together. And they all, I think, move together, at least in my telling of this story, to explain for, in particular, the dramatic power inside Kurosawa's filmic images.